Hello, friends, and welcome back to Heartscapes, where we explore the intersections between self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. Today, I am navigating the question of what are the essential elements of a practice? If you think about practices that you're in, whether they be spiritual or meditative practices, physical practices that help to build the body, intellectual practices of learning, any sort of practice that you have brought into your life, what are the essential elements that make it an effective practice? This was a question that we posed in this month's Intuition Lab. I had the opportunity to co-facilitate our Intuition Lab with Leaf Wild of Wildish Work Counseling. And he and I were feeling very intrigued by the question of what makes the essential aspects of a practice, specifically for the purpose of learning how to craft one's own practice spontaneously in a given moment. In other words, if there's a question that we're sitting with, or there's a particular skill or capacity like intuition that we want to build, there can be a dedicated practice that has a structure and form that we've adopted from other places, but there can also be spontaneous personal practices that come out of a particular moment, a particular desire that comes spontaneously from inside of us that still contain all of the essential elements of a practice and move us forward on that goal. So we got to play with our participants a bit on this question. We explored lots of different practices, from Reiki, the practice that we work with most often here in this space, to soul collage and other creative practices, to martial arts, to music making, to other forms of creative expression. Lots and lots of different practices that people brought into the space and analyzed for what makes them essential. And there were many, many things that came forward. For example, trust. For example, playfulness and creativity. And things like the ability to turn inward and at the same time tune in to the spaces around us. Comfort, coziness, safety. But paradoxically, at the same time, discomfort and the willingness and ability to make ourselves uncomfortable for the sake of our own growth. I'll put the entire list of what we came up with in the comments down below, and I encourage you to think on practices that are alive in your life and reflect on what are the essential elements that make it an effective and engaging practice for you, and share that with us so we can build on this list. I also wanted to invite you into a DIY practice. I'll give you an example with the one that I came up with in our Intuition Lab. So we landed on the question of, in this week, this coming week, is there something that we can play with that arises from our curiosity about practices and its essential elements that in some way addresses something of importance for us and helps us build our intuition? And we invited everybody to think about, or to allow the inspiration from our conversation to create a spontaneous structure. And there were three components that I really noticed occurring in everybody's shares that I would call the distillation of the essence of a practice. That is, that a practice must generate connection, effectiveness, and change. Connection, because we need to feel personally connected with any practice that we choose to take on. If we're going to dedicate time, energy, perhaps discomfort to taking on a practice, particularly on an ongoing basis, I would define a practice as something that we engage with more than once and on something of an ongoing basis, then we need to be able to connect with it. It needs to be personally meaningful for some reason. Effective. A practice, in order to, really work for us in our life and be worthwhile, has to be effective in engaging us around whatever the focus point, the goals, the central idea of that practice are. If we continue to engage in something over and over again, and we're not experiencing, any learning, any excitement, any enlightenment, any change around that practice, then it's not effective. So effectiveness, actually making movement on its purpose. And related to that is change. Ultimately, a practice is meant to change us. It's meant to take us from where we are through an experience of liminal space and to something that we are not yet. We're meant to change through practice, which is why discomfort is one of those essential elements that came out when we were listing. And at the same time, enough comfort and safety and trust to be able to be willing to stay with it. So with those three kind of large categories in mind of connection, effectiveness, and change, we created our DIY intuition building practices for this week. And I'm going to invite you to play with this and do the same for yourself. The one that I came up with involved collaborating with other people. So there's a particular question that I'm kind of sitting in my life right now that I don't have kind of a obvious, like ready-made wisdom about. In other words, I don't know what to do about this question as of yet. And so I'm allowing my intuition to give me information about which decision I might make, which direction I might move in. I'm allowing that to be an open process that unfolds over time rather than making a decision out of the pressure of wanting to be on the other side of this question. And so what I'm committing to doing is holding this question in my mind and following my intuition, noticing if I'm getting a message from my intuition. And I know how my intuition talks to me because I've been working with intuition for some time. And that's a question we work with on Intuition Lab all the time. How do we know it's our intuition speaking? So listening to my intuition and noticing if there's a moment where there's another person that I'm around that I might pose this question to. I'm not quite sure what form that will take, whether it'll be a hypothetical, what do you think about this situation, or what would you do in this situation, or perhaps something a little bit more esoteric, forming of the ideas around the situation. I'm not quite sure how it's meant to be phrased, but one way or the other, there's somebody out there in my world that I'll encounter in the next week or so who has some sort of wisdom for me on this question. They don't know that they have wisdom for me. When they speak it, they may not have any idea that they're providing something valuable to me. But somewhere out there is somebody that I'm meant to pose this question to. And the trick is that I have to be paying attention to what my intuition is telling me so that I notice when that moment has arisen. So, connection. I feel very connected to this practice that I've created because it revolves around something that matters to me, a question of importance that I really would like to have wisdom about, and it engages something that I'm very actively working with right now, which is intuition. Effectiveness. I suspect, I don't know yet because I haven't done it yet, but I suspect that if I am truly paying attention, because I'm connected to this question, that this practice will be effective in bringing some sort of insight to me. Not necessarily the right answer to my question. That's not really what I'm after. Some form of insight, some form of wisdom that I don't currently have access to. I trust that that will be the case. Trust, again, being an essential element of a practice. And I'm able to have that trust because I've done things like this before. I've had enough experiences with the effectiveness of doing a practice like this. And change. And for me, this comes back to the question of discomfort. There are a lot of intuition practices that I have learned from others or I have designed myself that involve collaborating with the world around us. Oracle cards are a great example. The whole practice of soul collage that I teach and practice with others and myself. Practices of going on a walk and just noticing what's happening in the environment. Lots and lots of ways in which we can collaborate with the world around us to develop our intuition and seek wisdom through our intuition. But directly engaging with other people in a spontaneous, unplanned way, possibly strangers or people I don't know well, around a question that has, significance, importance to me, there's tenderness around, feels really, really risky to me. It's really pushing my edge of comfort. It's getting me right up to the barrier of what I know and what's familiar with me and inviting me to take a next step. And this is how we often, this is a very important aspect of change. It's not the only way in which change happens, but it is a very powerful, very important way. Walking right up to the edge of what we know and what we have experienced before, and then choosing to take one step into the unknown. And so this particular practice will push me to do that because it's an unknown experience. It's not something I have done before specifically in this way. It feels a little bit risky. At the same time, I trust it. And therefore, I expect and feel confident that I will experience some form of change as a result of choosing to engage in it. So I may make another video with an update on how that went, if it feels worth reporting back on. But in the meantime, I invite you to play with these ideas and maybe choose one small thing that you can do this week that brings you right up to the edge of what you know and what you've experienced, and invites you to take one step further into the unknown, focused on something that matters to you, something that feels important. And then choose to engage that practice at least one time this week, maybe more than once if it feels right. And let me know how that goes. I'd love to hear what you come up with, anything about the experience that feels juicy and interesting to share. I'll put, again, our full list of what we came up with in Intuition Lab this week on what are the essential components of a practice. I invite you and encourage you to add to that list. And I'll also put information for learning about Leaf Wild and his wildish work counseling practice, which has some really juicy, amazing, very effective practices for engaging in this sort of work. And until next time, I love you all, and may you be deeply provisioned for the journey that you are on in this moment. Till next time, bye-bye.